Hello and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Moya Lothian-McLean. I've got over my cold, but luckily what's been left is a bit of a husk. So we've got a bit of a sultry voice going on tonight. And with me, co-hosting tonight is Tadhg. Hickey, Tadhg, hello.
Hi Moya, how's it going? Great to be back with you guys again.
I know, wow, quick regular. It's going well, but I cannot say the same for the rest of the world. And coming up later tonight, we've got Benjamin Netanyahu, who's spoken out against pro-Palestine protests, which are taking place across US college campuses. Labour have now announced their plans to nationalise the railways if they get into government, or have they? And a new report from the UN has highlighted the UK government's dire approach to disabled people. Power sharing in the Scottish Parliament has collapsed after First Minister Humza Yousaf ditched the SNP's coalition agreement with the Scottish Greens. This was the moment Yousaf announced that his party would now form a minority government.
Cooperation in any sphere of life is, almost by definition, a trade-off, one which the benefits of working together are held up against the limitations of compromise. And when it comes to our agreement with the Scottish Green Party, I've believed that the benefits have outweighed the compromises. When I said that the agreement was worth its weight in gold, I meant it. However, it is now my judgment that the balance has shifted. The Butte House Agreement was intended to provide stability to the Scottish Government, and it has made possible a number of achievements, but it has served its purpose. It's no longer guaranteeing a stable arrangement in Parliament. The events of recent days have made that clear. And therefore, after careful consideration, I believe that going forward, it is in the best interests of the people of Scotland to pursue a different arrangement. That is why, following a discussion with my cabinet this morning, I have formally notified Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater that I am terminating the Butte House Agreement with immediate effect.
The Butte House Agreement guaranteed 2 junior ministerial posts to the Greens, Lorna Slater and Patrick Harvie mentioned there. In exchange, the Greens offered the SNP a parliamentary majority, lending its 7 seats to the SNP in Holyrood on at least some issues. Now, in his speech, Yousaf mentioned some other issues around, quote, the events of recent days. Last week, the Scottish Government announced it was dropping its key climate target of reducing greenhouse gases by 3/4 by 2030. Days later, NHS Scotland blocked under-18s from receiving puberty blockers in response to the UK government's CAS report. These 2 decisions had led the Scottish Greens to announce that they would have a vote on whether to continue the power sharing agreement. But before they could, Yousaf made his announcement. Was it a case of jumping before you're pushed? Scottish Greens co-leader Lorna Slater gave Politics Live her account of what happened.
The First Minister asked Patrick Harvie and myself to come along to Butte House for a conversation, at which the First Minister told us of his decision to end the Butte House Agreement, which is the cooperation agreement that has been in place between the Scottish Greens and the Scottish Government for the last 2.5 years.
And this was his decision?
This was his decision. And I think that he has caved into the right wing of his party, to some of the most regressive, politics in Scotland, and undone our progressive cooperation agreement. We were doing something new and different. Parties cooperating together, investing in nature, working for better living wages for the people of Scotland. And the First Minister has chosen to end that agreement.
Right. Emotive language, caved in, moved to the right. What's your evidence for that?
The evidence for that is the people in the media who are celebrating the end of the cooperation agreement. Some of the most reactionary right-wing voices, the Conservatives, will be delighted. I am sad for the young people of Scotland, for future generations of Scotland. We had a vision working together of a greener, better future. We were enacting that vision. We were putting things into place: free bus travel for young people, ban on incineration, a freeze on rent during the cost of living crisis. And now we are looking at not being able to deliver those things.
In his speech, Humza Yousaf laid out the policy agenda that he hoped to take forward as a minority party in Holyrood.
I am clear that today marks a new beginning for the SNP government. I have a clear policy agenda that I wish to take forward, one that centres around growing our economy and supporting businesses, improving our NHS, tackling poverty and child poverty in particular, helping households during a Westminster cost of living crisis, standing up for the rights of everyone in Scotland, especially our most marginalised communities, and, for the avoidance of any doubt, tackling the climate emergency.
Now, that's a pretty ambitious programme, but it's one that Yousaf appears to have put at risk. The First Minister may now face a vote of no confidence following his breaking of the deal with the Greens. The motion is being lodged by the Scottish Conservatives, with leader Douglas Ross saying this in the Scottish Parliament.
I can confirm today that on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives, I am lodging a vote of no confidence in Humza Yousaf. He is a failed First Minister. He is focused on the wrong priorities for Scotland. He has governed in the SNP's interests and not in Scotland's interests. He is unfit for office. Shouldn't this be the end of the road for this weak First Minister?
Scottish Labour leader Anna Sawar appeared to back that call, saying this: Scottish Labour has no confidence in Humza Yousaf and the SNP government. We need an election now. The Scottish Lib Dems have said they will back a no-confidence vote too, and, crucially, just before we went on air, the Greens also said they would vote against Yousaf. This is very, very bad news for the Scottish First Minister, and that's because together, those four parties have 64 seats in Holyrood, whereas the SNP only has 63. Now there is one person who could rescue Yousaf. The Alba party is led by former SNP First Minister Alex Salmond, who resigned from the SNP in fury amid a political scandal. And its only SNP is Ash Reagan, who ran against Yousaf in the SNP leadership before quitting the party to join Alba. If she were to vote with Yousaf, it would be a draw, with the deciding vote going to the presiding officer. By convention, he or she, or they, must vote with the status quo, which would mean Yousaf surviving the vote. High drama indeed. Now, that no confidence vote is expected to take place in May. Remember, May is only a week away. I am joined now by author and political commentator Gerry Hassan. Gerry, thank you so much for being with us. In fact, returning to us, because we talked before and then new things happened. So now we're back, and I will ask you, firstly, why has Humza Yousaf torn up the Butte House Agreement?
There's been growing tensions between the SNP and the Greens over the SNP diluting climate change policies. There's been the toxicity of the trans issue in Scotland. But really, there's a couple of other underlying tensions is that the Greens have been a human shield for SNP criticism of the SNP leadership, and also by the other political parties, and as Lorna Slater said, right-wing media have really targeted the Greens as well, calling them extremist and all sorts of ridiculous hyperbole, partly weaponised by the trans issue. But the Greens have also shown they've come anew to government, and they've not really adapted to it in the sense of, like, you know, following the kind of professional protocols you're meant to. There've been small amount of them putting their foot in it, but nothing I would say major. But things that the political commentator have taken as kind of like some kind of like, you know, equivalent of crimes, basically. But those tensions have mounted because the SNP are on the way down, the SNP are facing crises, and basically Humza Yousaf is trying to give a pretense that he has authority, leadership, and that he is dictating events rather than events dictating him, basically.
Yeah, I want to get onto the crises in the SNP a little bit later, but first, Alaba's lone MSP is now potentially the King's Saver if the no confidence vote takes place. What are Alaba likely to get out of this from Yousaf?
If that happens, it would be dramatic events beyond the theatre of politics, and one of the biggest dramas we've ever seen in Scottish politics. Alba are. They're like Reform UK in the sense that they don't really exist as a mass political force. They are the creation of Alex Salmond's leaving the SNP and the rupture between him and Nicola Sturgeon. But in this case, it would be the ask that Ash Reagan would demand of the SNP would be policy concessions on things like trans issues, the various things that have been flagged up in the cash review in England and which have had ramifications in Scotland, the Greens standing for very pro-trans positions and being against the cash review. So it may well be something that actually, either by Humza Yousaf agreeing to anything from Ash Regan, he would sign his death warrant, his political death warrant, or he cannot agree to and has to go down with the ship.
A no confidence vote doesn't necessarily mean a Holyrood election either, does it?
No, the Scotland Act, the Scotland Act 1998 is basically a substitute for a kind of written constitution of Scotland, as much as any part of the United Kingdom can have. And what it lays down, if there's a vote of no confidence, it then says that within 28 days, there's a period for finding an alternative First Minister. Now, in that, the SNP don't have a majority, no party has a majority. There are alternative leaders of the SNP who could emerge. One obvious example would be Kate Forbes, who narrowly lost the SNP leadership election last year to Humza Yousaf. But the Greens have said that they already would vote against Kate Forbes as a replacement First Minister. So it remains to be seen if Humza Yousaf falls on his sword, or has to fall on his sword, whether all the other parties would not be able to find an alternative First Minister, which means, if that happens, we would have a special Holyrood election, not in the cycle of elections, and we've never had that. And then there'd be the issue of who gets to blame for it with the voters.
You talked a bit earlier about the fact this is a wider SNP crisis. Can you just elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, well, the SNP have been in office for 17 years, and at periods they've appeared impregnable. But no one's impregnable, and they were never even completely that when they appeared that, because they never won a majority of the Scottish vote. They were often aided by the weakness of their opponents, Labour and Tories. So 17 years of office just comes with a cost. It comes with a cost that they're a centre-left, I emphasise the word centre-left, party that does compromises, that compromises with big business, that doesn't redistribute, that doesn't address the big glaring inequalities we have in Scotland, because it wants to keep that coalition together of a centre and left. So there's a whole record of the party in government. There's then a crisis of party, which has seen a Police Scotland investigation, which the party governance, whatever the legality or not, the party governance was basically trashed in the Sturgeon era, because her and her husband, who ran the party, a bad combination in the sense of power, brought all sorts of consequences from that, of treating the party with contempt. And then there's the issue of independence, which the SNP have not really done the heavy lifting on since 2014 to make it appeal to those who are unconvinced by it. So those are three crises of party, government and independence, and also aided by the fact Scottish Labour are more popular now because British Labour's popular, and they're facing a set of electoral challenges. So there's a whole set of crises coalesced to mean that Humza Yousaf is in a kind of way like Rishi Sunak is a kind of tail-end Charlie premiership. This is a premiership without much political capital in it, and without much cut-through to voters.
How could the SNP reverse these fortunes? How can they see themselves on the up again? And what wider issues across the union would they tap into in order to do that?
Politics has cycles and a momentum to it. And once you've been in office 17 years and you've created the problems you face, obviously there are other structural problems in Scottish society and so on, and longer term problems, it's a bit difficult to just reinvent yourself in office continually. And I think that's what the SNP face. So I do think, as analysing the Scottish government's record and then the political dynamics of the SNP, it's very difficult for them to completely reinvent themselves by the 2024 Westminster elections, which are just coming up, and then by the 2026 Scottish Parliament elections. It is possible that after they've gone through some pains and renewal and trying to create a new leadership and a new culture, the SNP do have advantages in that they're seen as standing up for Scotland's interests in the UK. That's a very popular position they have. They stand for Scotland's right to decide its own future in terms of independence. And they stand for independence, which broadly half of Scotland support. So they have those medium to longer term advantages, but it's going to require a very different politics compared to the party, the way they've done government and the way they've done independence in, I actually think, since 2014 and the Sturgeon era, which then Yousaf has inherited a set of problems, and he doesn't have the capital to address them fundamentally.
Pro-Palestine protests have been spreading like wildfire across US college campuses, and now they have Israel's Prime Minister shook. This was Benjamin Netanyahu addressing not his own country, but America.
What's happening on America's college campuses is horrific. Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s. It's unconscionable. It has to be stopped. It has to be condemned, and condemned unequivocally. But that's not what happened. The response of several university presidents was shameful. Now, fortunately, state, local, federal officials, many of them have responded differently, but there has to be more. More has to be done. It has to be done not only because they attack Israel, that's bad enough. Not only because they want to kill Jews wherever they are, that's bad enough. It's also, when you listen to them, it's also because they say not only death to Israel, death to the Jews, but death to America. And this tells us that there's an anti-Semitic surge here that has terrible consequences.
Death to Israel, death to the Jews, death to America. I would really like to see some receipts because the overwhelming evidence points to peaceful protests on campus, which include, of course, a large number of Jewish students. This week, the Jewish holiday of Passover began, and on many campuses, protesting Jewish students held multi-denominational seders, breaking bread with Palestinians and others to celebrate the story of the liberation of Jews from slavery in Egypt. And at Columbia University, which has been at the heart of US college pro-Palestinian activism, Jewish students and faculty explained to CNN why Benjamin Netanyahu does not speak for them.
Passover is the story of our escape from slavery in the land of Egypt. And I think we need to recognize that on Passover, it's important to stand up for oppressed people everywhere, whether they're Jewish or not.
If our gathering does not motivate us to do everything in our power to end the genocidal violence Israel is unleashing upon Gaza, we will not have fulfilled the requirements of the Passover Seder.
I am Jewish, and to me, Passover symbolizes perseverance and resilience. And I think this encampment encompasses those two ideals because we have seen the university take countless measures to try to suppress our student activism, and here is us persevering through that.
I had seen so many statements online about how Jews weren't safe, about how Columbia had turned into a hotbed of anti-Semitism. Each of those statements further galvanized me to use my voice and my privilege as a Jewish person to come here and have a Seder with all of these lovely people.
I'm part of a really proud legacy of progressive Jewish activists who have participated in things like the civil rights movement or the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s, where it's so important to us to transcend the barriers of race, class, ethnicity, religion. And that's what's happening here today. And there's a lot of joy here, I think really for the first time on campus in months.
There were also many non-Jewish students who joined the Seder, and we're a little bit hesitant about whether they should eat matzah or not. We told them it was okay, you can try some matzah. It was really a beautiful thing to see in the middle of the pro-Palestinian encampment.
Of course, it's very important for Benjamin Netanyahu to shore up support in the US by linking the Palestinian struggle with an existential threat to Jewish people, because that keeps pressure on his political allies who have been gradually distancing themselves from his genocidal regime. In his address, Netanyahu also tried to tap into wider fears of a war, hinting at even the threat of a global conflagration.
We see this exponential rise of anti-Semitism throughout America and throughout Western societies as Israel tries to defend itself against genocidal terrorists who hide behind civilians. Yet it is Israel that is falsely accused of genocide, Israel that is falsely accused of starvation and all sundry war crimes. It's all one big libel, but that's not new. We've seen in history that anti-Semitic attacks were always preceded by vilification and slander. Lies that were cast against the Jewish people that are unbelievable, yet people believe them. And what is important now is for all of us who are interested and cherish our values and our civilization, to stand up together and to say enough is enough. We have to stop anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. It always precedes larger conflagrations that engulf the entire world. So I ask all of you, Jews and non-Jews alike, who are concerned with our common future and our common values, to do one thing: stand up, speak up, be counted. Stop anti-Semitism now.
Netanyahu is right about one thing. Anti-Semitism is a scourge that should never be tolerated. But in conflating the political project of Zionism with the Jewish ethnicity and conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, Netanyahu contributes to the problem. His suggestion that he speaks for all Jews carries with it the implication that all agree with him, which they certainly do not. And associating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism serves a very clear political purpose too. Also speaking in New York was Jewish public intellectual Naomi Klein. Leading at Seder in the Streets, she said this.
I've been thinking about Moses and his rage when he came down from the mount to find the Israelites worshiping a golden calf. The ecofeminist in me has always been uneasy about this story. What kind of God is jealous of animals? What kind of God wants to hoard all the sacredness of the earth for himself? But there is, of course, a less literal way of understanding this story. It is a lesson about false idols, about the human tendency to worship the profane and shiny, to look to the small and material rather than the large and transcendent. What I want to say to you this evening at this revolutionary and historic Seder in the streets is that too many of our people are worshiping a false idol once again. Yes. They are enraptured by it, they are drunk on it, they are profaned by it, and that false idol is called Zionism. Yes. It is a false idol that takes our most profound biblical stories of justice and emancipation from slavery, the story of Passover itself, and turns them into brutalist weapons of colonial land theft, roadmaps for ethnic cleansing and genocide.
Now, Netanyahu's viewpoint may be wrong and definitely dangerous, but it's shared by some American lawmakers. Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, a Republican, said this at the Columbia campus.
My intention is to call President Biden after we leave here and share with him what we have seen with our own two eyes and demand that he take action. There is executive authority that be appropriate. If this is not contained quickly, and if these threats and intimidation are not stopped, there is an appropriate time for the National Guard. We have to bring order to these campuses. We cannot allow this to happen around the country. We are better than this.
That threat to call in the National Guard is extreme, especially considering what happened on one of the last times they were called to student protests in the US. In 1970, at the height of student protests against the Vietnam War, the National Guard were called in to crush protests at Kent State University in Ohio. They opened fire on students, killing 4 and wounding 9. The murders galvanized students across the country, leading to widespread protests, including a mass demonstration in Washington, D.C. The pro-Palestine protests have been met with force by many college administrators already. Police have been called in at Columbia, New York University and Yale, just to name a few. And at the Austin campus of the University of Texas, this happened after state police were called in. God, those shots of armed police taking down unarmed students, it really does tell you what side of history people are on. Tadhg, if Netanyahu is getting involved with denouncing American student activism, does this suggest that this group has a chance of influencing policymakers?
I think definitely. I think first and foremost, Netanyahu intervening illustrates just how the absurd levels that the Israeli regime are willing to go to defend genocide effectively. Like, he's asking us to believe that, to use his own terms, anti-Semitic mobs have descended on campus. So, like, where did these anti-Semitic mobs come from? Like, you're talking about the cream of the crop student base across America, some of the most like talented students in the world, have suddenly become like Nazis, you know? And I'm saying Nazis playfully, but that's actually what he said. He conjured up 1930s Germany. So I feel like Zionism is a psychosis, and I think that man personifies it wonderfully. It also shows the depth, like when you showed the Republican representative, the depth of the relationship between the US and Israel and how toxic that relationship is. And I'm literally just getting my head around. I'm reading about Christian Zionists at the moment, which is a trip. If anyone wants to check that out, I'm actually doing a sketch about it tomorrow. But it goes so deep, and the two countries are so bad for each other in so many ways. But to answer your question directly, I think this student protest explosion is the most significant thing to happen to the pro-Palestine movement in the last 6 months, I think. You can see that the elitists are absolutely terrified. I think absolutely nobody wants to see another Kent State University situation as you described. But I think even the images that we're seeing so far, with kids being tasered, kids being beat up, kids being arrested, the optics are already such that the only thing we're going to see is more and more protests. And the idea that Biden, who's really struggling with the youth vote at the moment, is going to win back support of young people by arresting them and beating them up is just absolutely astonishing to me. But again, it just shows, to go back to this depth of relationship, that I feel the US has lost its mind and is willing to actually lose itself with its fidelity to this rogue state. It goes that deep. But I have to say I'm excited, and I would finish up by saying I would love to see the students of Britain and Ireland join them and across Europe. This seems like it's a mass movement, and it's a really significant blow to the Zionists, because you can see online they're absolutely losing their minds.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's a mass movement that has been spectacularly organised by Palestine youth groups. Really incredible show of organising. What's also fascinating is, someone like Mike Johnson, who went to the campuses and previously has talked about this scourge of censorship and free speech. He stood on the Columbia campus and he said, "We respect free speech, we respect diversity of ideas, but there is a way to do that in a lawful manner, and that's not what this is. A bunch of students in tents holding peaceful seders is not a lawful manner." It just goes to show what interests people are respecting or protecting when they talk about free speech. The Labour Party has announced it will re-nationalise Britain's rail network within 5 years of coming to power if it wins the next election. Shadow Transport Minister Louise Haigh had revealed the pledge today, and she wrote this in the Daily Mirror. A Labour government will bring private train services into public ownership, or take each private rail contract back into public hands as it reaches its end, so taxpayers don't have to pay a penny in compensation. We'll establish a new body, Great British Railways, and a tough new passenger watchdog to hold them to account on behalf of passengers. I'm pretty sure Great British Railways was the name of the company mooted by Boris Johnson. So they've just straight borrowed that. Labour estimated the plan would save the state around £2.2 billion. And they also want to establish a watchdog to ensure passenger standards are being consistently met. Of course, those with a stake in private rail operations are not happy. Andy Bagnall is from Rail Partners, which represents private operators on the rail network. And he spoke to BBC Radio 4's Today programme about Labour's proposals.
There was a track record of those private operators growing the railway. We'd seen passenger numbers decline steadily under British Rail, but during the era of privatisation, passenger numbers doubled, services increased by a third, half as many people again working in the industry.
Fares went up by 20% in real terms?
Well, they did, but look, there's a lot of misconception around fares. Fares are regulated. Half of the fares are set by the government, and actually successive governments have chosen to shift the balance of funding for the railway from the taxpayer to the fare payer, starting all the way back in 2004 under the last Labour government.
But we see with London in particular, you look at that as an example, London Underground and Transport for London. Now London Underground takes huge subsidies from the government, doesn't it? It's begging for money all the time, and it's had to have vast injections of cash. Is that what we'd see under the model that you're now proposing for the rest of the country?
No, we would argue that the model of nationalisation will lead to higher costs. You lose that commercial focus of the operator. The approach that gets the best of the both worlds, it gives you a joined up system, like Transport for London has, is to have Great British Railways as a public sector body, but then harnessing operators to really focus outwards on the passenger, attract passengers back and regrow the railway. That's good for passengers, obviously, in the sense of the operators giving them what they want, but it's also critically good for the taxpayer in that will ensure that the railway takes as little subsidy as possible. And that's the danger with nationalisation, that we believe without that commercial focus, costs would creep up over time, revenue growth would be slower, and the taxpayer is the one that loses out.
Representatives with interest in private rail operations love to cite privatisation as being responsible for growing the use of rail on behalf of passengers, but in fact 2018 research from the Independent Trade Commission said increased passenger traffic was because of changes in housing and employment and geography, such as a shift to office-based commuter work. Ditto, a lot of rail growth was in the southeast of England, particularly London. Elsewhere, other arguments were being made that actually we should privatise the railways more to make them work better. This is what RMT boss Mick Lynch had to say about that to Julia Hartley-Brewer on Talk TV.
We've never really had proper privatisation where we could actually have competition. Is that feasibly possible on a railway where you've only got one track?
Julia, was the rest of privatisation successful? You haven't got competition in water; it's collapsed. It used to be owned by the counties and the towns. You've had record price increases in electricity and gas. The private companies will do nothing unless they're subsidised. They're not investing capital. The electricity companies and the water companies have extracted billions for shareholder profit, and the systems are collapsing because they haven't invested. The train operating companies haven't invested a penny in the railway in 30 years. We've subsidised them the whole time while they've taken approximately £10 billion out of the system in profit. So the whole thing has been a disaster. Rail track collapsed under its own incompetence. That had to be taken back. The privatisation of London Underground through Metronet and tube lines collapsed. And that was a Labour privatisation, by the way, so I'm fair-handed. Ken Livingstone had to take that back, and it cost us billions. There is no privatisation that's been successful that I can see in terms of our key infrastructure services. We need a railway that's coherent, that's part of an integrated transport policy that includes bus, includes local services, even our ferry services with the P&O disaster that we've had. We've got services in the west of Scotland that need restructuring. So
hold on a minute. Ferry services in Scotland are in a mess because the SNP failed to actually get two ferries on order at a reasonable price.
Well, that's their incompetence, and they're accountable for that. The good thing is they are accountable. The fat cats in the train operating companies have not been accountable. They hide behind the minister. What's going to happen here is that we'll have an accountable chief executive or chairman of Great British Rail who we can point the finger at, both staff, passengers, taxpayers and the commentariat, and say, you are responsible.
Now, Labour's plans sound like a bold step forward, and Louise Haigh reportedly had to fight hard not to have these proposals watered down. But it's not actually full nationalisation, and don't shoot the messenger, it might not do much to change Britain's status as having the most expensive train tickets in Europe. To explain why, I'm now joined by Gareth Dennis, who is a lecturer in British rail infrastructure and host of the Rail Natter YouTube show. Gareth, can you tell us quickly, why aren't Labour's plans full nationalisation?
Yeah, so, we have a hybrid system as it is now. For starters, the track has been nationalised for quite a long time. But the rent extraction that comes from our railways, on one hand, we've got actually the minority of the rent extraction comes from the train operating companies. So they're the ones who put staff on the trains and run the services. But the trains they run on are hired, are leased, are rented from rolling stock operating companies. So train leasing companies that Labour have absolutely no intention of touching. They've said within their plans, we're not going to touch these, we're going to leave them as it is, and which was a delight to, I'd quote one chief executive from one of the major rolling stock operating companies who says, we welcome the Labour Party's commitment to leverage private capital to help deliver its long-term strategy for rolling stock. So, very much kind of business as usual. The trouble with that is, well, firstly, the existence of those companies results in an enormous amount of extraction of money from the system. As much as indeed slightly over £1 billion went to the rolling stock operating companies a year or so ago. That's 1 year. That's about a tenth of the money that the rail industry gets from government. So a tenth, one in every £10 the government put into the railways went out to the rolling stock operating companies. Now, every year isn't quite that high, but it's still hundreds of millions of pounds a year that are lost. Interestingly, go to Panama and other low tax and no tax havens to be squirreled away and never to be seen again. So it's a major amount of rent extraction from the rail industry that the government that Labour are not intending to resolve. The reason I stumbled there and said government is another factor, is that what's being proposed by Labour is, there's some bold words within the plan. I'll caveat that there are some bolder words in these plans than in the plans that the current government have come up with. But if you strip away some of that rhetoric and just look at what's materially being proposed, it's pretty much exactly what the current government are also proposing. So it's not quite as radical as the railway needs it to be honest.
Really boil this down for our audience. Rolling stock, that means the physical trains, right? And they are being leased back to train operating companies who do the services, like, say, Avanti. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. So those trains are not owned by the companies that run the services. They hire them off another company that buys them. And this is where you get this claims from the chap who's in charge of Rail Partners, which everything he said is nonsense, by the way. We can unpick that another time in the future, I'm sure. But the key factor is that the reason that he can say, the private money has been brought in is because at exorbitant commercial rates, we have bought, the taxpayers paid for rolling stock bought on commercial markets that we could have bought ourselves for essentially 0% interest rates through government funding and government borrowing. So we are paying the rents of these trains that have, for example, the trains that are currently running on the East Coast Main Line and Great Western, the Azumas as they're called on the East Coast Main Line, one of the most expensive contracts for rail for trains in history across the world. Just eye-wateringly expensive for this essentially kind of PFI max to hire these trains that we could have just bought ourselves at 0% interest rate. And it would have, as a result, fares would have just immediately been less as a result of that enormous, that reduction in rent seeking. So yeah, not a complete picture being seen here by the Labour Party, unfortunately.
And the two things that, as a consumer and a rail passenger that I think impact me most is prices and a lack of services. Will Labour's plans help bring down prices and increase services at all, or are there other factors in play beyond taking the services back into public ownership?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there, Moya. The main issue we have on our network that results in high fares is actually that the only way we maintain a moderately not too overcrowded, I'll be very honest, everyone who takes the train plays a game of sardines most of the time, but our railways would be even more saturated if we had fairer fares. So, fares that were kind of closer to the mainland Europe. The reason for that is that we use fares to limit demand so that we don't have dangerous levels of overcrowding. The reason for that is because we do not have enough rail capacity. Now, that's not just because of a lack of trains. It's because of a lack of new investment, new tracks. And we've seen the cancellation of HS2. Labour unwilling to commit to returning to that plan, for which there is no reason not to. They say, government have messed it up so much. No, they haven't. Government have sold all the land. No, they haven't sold a single scrap of land yet. All the land is there, bought, ready to keep building the line as proposed. HS2 is a critical component in unlocking that capacity and allowing fares to reduce. So that's one major factor is we need a lot more rail capacity, and that's not just going to come from tweaking the existing network. We need big change, not just HS2, but major urban rail projects as well. And also the fact that they allude to it in their plan, so it's not completely devoid of thinking about strategy, but they haven't really tackled it head on. At the front page, the first page is Keir Starmer going on about we're going to have a mission-led government, and they haven't actually described what the mission is for railways. They haven't described the mission for public transport in general, which is, by the way, to drive modal shift away from air and road. So they haven't actually said what is the mission, which they could have said now. It wouldn't have trapped them in a corner in any way whatsoever. They could have said that. They haven't. So I'm worried that a lot of the strategic discussion is talk more than it's not going to result in the meaningful action. Fundamentally, we need more capacity to reduce fares and to make our journeys more comfortable.
What sort of rail infrastructure projects would we need to see to actually make a difference to the quality of British railways?
The trouble we have on our railways is that they kind of do everything all at once. I've got the literal Beeching report is behind my head right now, which the problem with the Beeching report wasn't so much that it closed rural lines. It's the problem that it closed lots of urban lines and meant that we had intercity and suburban services running on the same tracks. What we need is a lot more suburban capacity because that's where most people make their journeys. The problem is we can't run more suburban capacity because the intercity trains, the ones that don't stop at any of the local stations, are in the way. So what we need is new high-speed lines to take those intercity services, get rid of them, get them off onto their own lines, like you see in mainland Europe. And that allows cities to fundamentally not just run more services, but also to get back control of their own services. So, for example, Manchester and Birmingham as well, another good example, would be able to run its own self-contained suburban network without worrying about intercity services getting in the way. And as a result of that, you'd be able to run many more services. So, we're not talking about fiddling around the edges. We need massive, drastic, fundamental upgrades to capacity. And HS2 was one of the projects that would have delivered that. Other projects as well. We need, Manchester and Birmingham both need kind of cross-rail level urban rail project investment as well. But it has to be as part of a big picture. It can't be dribs and drabs. It has to be part of a big picture. And it also has to be as part of widespread devolution away from Westminster. This cannot be led from Westminster. It has to be led by the regions, has to be led by the cities.
Being led by the regions, Labour have talked a bit more about devolving powers. Have they shown any signs of that? And also, my second question is, transport touches everyone's lives. It is something that people really invested in, especially with the railways. Why are Labour unwilling to go the full hog?
Yeah, I don't, to answer the last point, I don't know why they don't, because it's such an obvious winner. Firstly, nationalisation, much as the picture is more complicated than nationalisation, I think people's desire to travel and desire to have better railways is represented by that nationalisation polling, which is hugely popular, of course. I think another example of how popular and important railways are to people is that we had nearly 1 million people, 750,000 people responding to the ticket office closure consultation, which meant that government had to U-turn on that. So we've seen how important railways are to people. We also know that transport is the UK's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So there are no downsides. All the other stuff as well, isolation, populism, all the spatial planning problems we have, car dependence, air pollution. I could list, in fact, I literally am listing all of them because I'm writing a book about it at the moment. There are so many problems that transport is necessary to solve. It's also a fundamental human desire and right, as well as warmth, shelter, food, water, clothing, well-being, the ability to move, mobility. And at the moment, we have designed mobility around metal boxes, 2-ton metal boxes, rather than around collective mobility, shared mobility. Rail has to be the backbone of that. So I don't see any reason for it not to be a winner all round for Labour to really push hard on it. So I think the probable reality is that Rachel Reeves' obsession with fiscal rules is why Labour is having to be very cautious in its approach, which is very frustrating. So I think that's the limitation. There is only we are only standing to benefit if we have a better railway system, because roads become more clear if we have a better public transport system. We get our space back. We get our time back. Railways are only a good thing. So it's frustrating that Labour haven't run with this, despite the current shape of the Labour Party being, perhaps not quite so imagination-fueled about the future.
I'm just going to quickly ask you about devolution as well, because there's a big sort of song and dance that's made about, devolving transport powers, level 3 powers back to the regions. But they don't actually give the metro mayors and the combined authorities that much control over the real problems with transport and rail. Is that right?
Absolutely. Fundamentally, we need Treasury level powers. Well, I mean, Treasury needs to be got rid of fundamentally. It's one of the key things that wrecks the economy in this country. Lots of other writing on that, I'm sure. But anyway, put that to one side. In the process of smashing Treasury to bits, we need to put all the powers of funding, lots of those need to be devolved away in the same way they currently are to Scotland. Wales needs to get more of those funding powers, but also the city regions. I would also argue a federalised England would be a good idea. So, ideally devolving that power to the north, to the southwest, empowering the combined authorities and the subnational transport bodies to actually make funding decisions themselves, to build the rail networks that they need. Because that's fundamentally the only way we can deliver a transport network, not just a rail network, but a transport network that works for everyone, is by devolving power closer to the people who actually use those services. Yes, there needs to be strategic oversight. We have long distance services that will continue to run. Again, the advantage of High Speed 2 is that the long distance services kind of are self-contained, so you can more easily devolve those lines and the powers kind of alongside kind of administrative boundaries, but that power needs to be distributed correctly. There are advantages to having a central railway organisation in terms of having the skills, the rolling stock, the centralised standards, all that boring stuff that I do in my day job day to day. But those can then be kind of leveraged rather by those cities and by those regions to provide services that match the needs of local people. Not just passenger services though, freight services, mapped onto an industrial strategy as well.
Gareth, Dennis, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm excited to have you on again to talk about rail because it's a passion project of mine. Before we move on, a quick plug for a related video. We were just talking about devolution quite a lot there. And we've just dropped a documentary from me on devolution and metro mayors. Here's a quick preview.
The model of economic development and solving problems that we've had for the last 30 plus years in the Northeast with European money is not the model that's going to solve the problems. For years, we've had the consultants going to the West, for example, end of Newcastle, East End of Newcastle, getting them paid, doing some work, then they leave, and there's nothing left behind. We've got to change that. The model has to change, and we have to get place-based community solutions established that connect with the locals, bring them some hope. They see something actually happening there, and it grows. It can grow, and I think we're a strong example of that. The bakery is a good embedded example. We can't move the bakery. That oven's never going anywhere in my lifetime. And that's what's important, I think, so that they see you've truly invested in the place. You're not just a talker, an academic who will come and leave, or a consultant saying, I've been one of them and I didn't like it.
What do you hear from the general public about their relationship to local politics, to whether they even know there's a mayor?
I think there's very little understanding of that there's a regional mayor coming, much more wider geographical area and at the local level. And they don't have to think about that. They're worried about feeding their families and all the uncertainties that exist in their lives. We need to help address them and make them feel a sense of community, because the community it's been undermined in so many places. I think the politics has got such a bad rep over the last 20, 30 years. People disengage across all areas, and we've got to change that. Food's quite political, you know.
Now, if you don't know what devolution is, it's the handing back of power and responsibility to the regions. And the Conservatives say that it could regenerate neglected areas of England. But is that the truth? We don't think enough people know what devolution is, and it's happening at a really rapid lick. By 2025, if all devolution deals that are in the works go through, the majority of England will be covered by a metro mayor. This is something important. This is a change to regional governments, and that's why we made this mini-series. So the first episode is out now. The link to that video should be in the description below. For those watching live, it should be pinned in the chat too. Check it out. There is an episode 2 coming, which we trail at the end of this doc with an appearance from someone you might recognise. The EU and the UN have called for independent investigation into mass graves discovered at Al-Shifa and Nasser hospitals in Gaza. And now the US has chimed in too. This was US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
Those reports were deeply disturbing. We have been in touch at multiple levels with the Israeli government. We want answers. We want to understand exactly what happened. You've seen some public commentary from the IDF on that, but we want to know the specifics of what the circumstances of this were, and we want to see this thoroughly and transparently investigated so that the whole world can have a comprehensive answer, and we, the United States, can as well.
You'll have noticed that that wasn't a call for an independent investigation, and while the world awaits that specific, transparent and definitely thorough report from the potential perpetrators of the crimes in question, Joe Biden last night signed into law a $17 billion aid package to Israel. Meanwhile, the details emerging from Gaza grow ever grimmer. Al Jazeera has reported on new evidence of torture on some of the nearly 400 bodies exhumed from 2 mass graves. According to a member of Gaza's Civil Defense Force, 10 bodies have been found with bound hands. Others still had medical tubes attached to them, suggesting they may have been buried alive. And Al Jazeera also says it has seen video and photographic evidence of the bodies of children in the mass graves. It's in that context that Jerusalem Deputy Mayor Gerry Hassan appeared on Sky News. Kate Burley began the interview by asking her this.
At least 283 corpses found in a mass grave at Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. The UN Human Rights Chief has said he is absolutely horrified. Who do you think those bodies are?
Probably terrorists, because the ratio of combatant to innocent that Israel has is unprecedented in modern warfare. We know we've killed about 15,000 terrorists. There was a terrible battle in those areas. So the chances are...
How do you think these people died?
In gun battles with Israel.
Why do you think some of the bodies were found with ties around their hands?
Well, because we probably arrested the terrorists.
And then killed them?
Well, I don't know if the terrorists fought back. I wasn't there.
Striking, isn't it? Presented with the suggestion that IDF troops may have executed handcuffed people. The deputy mayor doesn't say, of course not. She says, I don't know, and maybe they fought back. Now that suggests that, in her mind anyway, it's perhaps not totally unreasonable, let alone criminal proposition, that Israeli soldiers should kill people when their hands are tied. That interview went on.
Just to clarify for me, if you would, how do they fight back with their hands tied behind their backs?
Well, we don't know what they were doing before their hands were tied behind their backs, do we?
No, but if you've managed to cable tie them, they shouldn't,
yes, and maybe,
shouldn't subsequently find them dead, should we?
And maybe, again, we're just conjecturing. Maybe his friend threw a grenade, and then what happens? Maybe there was a missile, maybe they threw a rocket, and then what happens? Again, this is conjecture. I wasn't there, you weren't there. We can't know. All I know is that our army has the highest...
Neither was Amnesty International, and they say there's been a lack of access for human rights investigators.
It's a shame that they're not worried about the lack of access to hostages who haven't been visited.
Come on to hostages in a moment. That's also on my list to talk to you, but what would you say to Amnesty International saying there's been a lack of access for human rights investigators?
We're in the middle of a war. They want access. They'll have access after the war. How could we let them in? Let's say we let them in and 3 of them get killed. And then what happens? Who's to blame?
Now, she isn't wrong. It would be extremely dangerous for investigators to enter Gaza during a war, although somehow the UN has managed to produce a report on human rights abuses in the Russia-Ukraine war. But given the overwhelming evidence that has emerged of war crimes in Gaza, it's yet another compelling reason to order a ceasefire, which would allow investigators into Gaza. Of course, that may not be in Israel's interests. On the subject of IDF brutality, in another part of that interview, Burley brought up Israel's Netza Yehuda battalion. Stationed in the West Bank, it's facing sanctions from the US over its inhumane treatment of Palestinians. Here's what Hassan had to say about that.
I think it sets a very, very bad precedent, not just for Israel, but for any law-abiding country with its own internal army scrutiny.
Are you proud of this unit?
Well, of course not. Who can be? I'm proud of the unit. I'll tell you why. I'm proud of the unit because it's done something that the whole of Israeli society want the ultra-Orthodox to do, and that is serve their country. And some wonderful, wonderful examples of young men who are serving their country, who used to be learning full-time, whose parents actually threw them out of their homes because they decided to serve their country. Am I proud of the behavior or 1 or 2 rogue members of that unit? Of course not. They should be in jail, and many of them already went to jail.
There have been several other incidents, as I'm sure you're aware, in recent years, some captured on video, in which soldiers were accused of or charged with abusing Palestinian detainees. So I suppose the suggestion is that it's not just a one-off by this battalion.
Like I said, any single army in the world, you could say about the American army, you could say it about the British army. If you went into every single piece of behavior that they do, you would find things that are not acceptable. And this is what's happened here. But like I said, the Israeli army, the IDF, has very robust internal investigation scrutiny. We have soldiers, our own soldiers in jail. We have our own soldiers who've been dismissed. We have our own apparatus. We don't need anybody to tell us how to handle our own army.
Now, immediately after that interview, something very interesting happened. Kay Burley went to Dominic Waghorn, Sky's correspondent in Jerusalem, and this is what he thought of that interview.
I think Fleur Hassan was incorrect in a number of ways, particularly to do with the Netza Yehuda battalion, and so the record should be corrected. She said it's an old story. It's an old story in terms of what happened to Omar Assad, who was a 78-year-old Palestinian-American man who Israeli soldiers from that battalion detained, handcuffed, blindfolded, gagged, and then left. And was then found to have died of a stress-induced heart attack, according to Palestinian doctors, sometime later. But it's old in the sense that that story is 2 years old. But what's not old is the fact that the American government is expected in the coming hours or days to cut off that particular battalion from American assistance under the Leahy laws, which prohibit the American government to giving any assistance, military or otherwise, to any members of foreign security forces who are guilty of gross or suspected to be guilty of gross violations of human rights and whose governments have not done enough to punish them. And that is a major development. It's the first time, if it happens, that the American government has sanctioned in this way any part of the Israeli military. And it could be the beginning of a process of other units being charged or at least alleged to have done this and then being punished in that sense by the Americans. She also said that the soldiers in that case were sent to jail, which is not correct. The Israeli authorities decided not to bring any criminal charges against any of the soldiers in that case, even though the IDF investigation found the units guilty of moral failings and a lack of discipline. One commanding officer was reprimanded and 2 soldiers were suspended for 2 years, but no one was sent to jail. And that, I have to say, is the norm, even though people like Israeli officials like Gerry Hassan insist that the Israeli military is one of the most moral in the world and say it has a robust prosecution system of holding soldiers to account. Very rarely are soldiers prosecuted in a criminal sense, and that certainly was the case with this incident involving the Nationalist Yehuda battalion. She also says that that was a kind of, on the whole, the battalion is behaving in a way you'd expect it to. There are some rogue elements. The fact is, this battalion is notorious for a string of alleged human rights abuses, from unlawful killings, from the death of Omar Assad 2 years ago, but also including electrocution of Palestinians, sexual assault, torture, and other abuses. And therefore, that's one of the reasons it's been taken out of action from the West Bank and sent to the Golan. So I think she's misrepresented that battalion. And that is rather symptomatic, I think, of the way Israeli officials tend to downplay allegations against the Israeli military. And for the first time, the American government is not accepting that at face value and is now taking action against one battalion in the Israeli military.
Now, it isn't much, but I don't think we would have seen Sky's own correspondent debunking an Israeli official in real time on air 6 months ago, or even 2 months ago. The dial for what can be pushed back on seems to be moving for some of the mainstream media. But is it too little, too late? Tadhg, has mainstream media now decided that it's time to push back against official Israeli narratives of what's happening in Gaza? And if so, why now?
I feel like it obviously is too late for the people who have been murdered, of course. But no, it's not too late, because I think it's evidence of the fact that the protests are working, the rallies are working. I mean, politicians and mass media, they have to follow what the people want ultimately. If the protests are so significant and the rallies are so significant, they have to adapt. And I think 6 months into this genocide, people can see what way the wind is blowing, and it is definitely to be applauded that media is finally, and it's a paltry level, it's such a low level to call out the basic lies, but I think for too long the Israeli regime has been used to lying and used to getting away with lying. I mean, even Fleurs basically following the blueprint that Israel always follows when it's accused of war crimes. It's like, initially, did you do it? No, it was Hamas. Okay, we did do it, but we didn't mean it. We did do it, we actually meant it, but there were terrorists. No, we did do it, we did mean it, and it was civilians, but why do you keep asking us questions? That's anti-Semitic. So I think everyone is seeing through the lies. The protests are growing in momentum, and I think people like Sky News and also leading politicians in Britain and the US are kind of seeing which way the wind blows, and they don't want to be complicit in a genocide, and they don't want to go down in history as a genocide apologist. So too little, too late for the people who've been murdered, but I think for the wider Palestinian movement towards justice, liberation, and statehood, I think it's a very significant development that Sky News are broadcasting such events, and that CNN in particular are capturing the thoughts of Jewish students on these campuses who, again, don't want to be associated with the Zionist project at all. And it's really important for those Jewish voices to stand up and be heard, because that's the other problem with the conflation that the Israeli regime does. It silences all those many Jewish voices. And as you know, and I know, some of the most important pro-Palestine voices are Jewish.
Is this also specific to English media, do you think? Have they been slower to push back on Israeli narratives?
I don't think so. I mean, even in Ireland here with our national broadcaster RT, for too long, they've followed the kind of party line in terms of what the IDF are telling them to say. So again, you get this, differentiation between the people and media and politicians. I mean, Ireland has been very guilty of making a lot of the right noises in terms of the politicians, but actually in real terms, the actions have been very small. And again, our media is very similar. So I think it's a case of the people, again, are hitting the streets and rallying and boycotting, and the numbers are growing to a point where the mass media and the politicians have to adapt. And that's why this latest development with the students, it's just going to keep rolling. And as you pointed out earlier, you know, this was a key moment in Vietnam where the students started protesting. And the ordinary person, when they look at the peaceful protests of people and they look at the elitists who are running for cover and trying to smear them by saying that they're terrorists or they're mobs of anti-Semites, again, the average person kind of sees through this trick. And what's really going on is that, yeah, corporate interests are really under threat by, I hope and pray, the death of the Zionist hegemony.
The UK has failed to address human rights violations suffered by disabled people. That's the conclusion of a damning new report published by the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or UNCRPD. The report comes after several years of UN investigations into whether the UK government has violated the rights of disabled people in key areas, including housing. A special inquiry in 2016 concluded that yes, disabled people were having their rights violated by the UK government. And in March 2024, UNCRPD gave the UK government another chance to show improvements and change since that last report. But things have remained stagnant or, in some cases, gotten worse. The list of things that the UNCRPD flagged concern over is long and distressing, but key points include the UK government's failure to meet its obligations in ensuring disabled people and their representative organisations have a say in decision-making that affects their lives. UK government reforms have resulted in hate speech, crimes and hostility towards disabled people by framing them as, quote, undeserving and defrauding the welfare system. No progress has been made on the right of disabled people to live independently and be included in the community. Increasing rates of institutionalisation and detainment of disabled people due to a lack of community-based support. Evidence of abuse and mistreatment in these institutions, even resulting in unexpected deaths. Deaths by suicide linked to engagement with the UK benefit system, and a lack of adequate welfare provision for disabled people, which is magnified for disabled refugees and asylum seekers. The committee has made a bunch of recommendations for the UK government, and lots of these are basic. They say the UK needs to meet its obligations towards disabled people and their human rights under the UN Convention. But the committee has also recommended the UK government take these actions, such as amending hate crime law to protect disabled people, and undertaking an inquiry into the work capability assessment, which replaces the system with a single health and disability functional assessment that's based on the human rights model of disability. Also, that the UK government takes measures to comprehensively support people with disabilities via the welfare system, including a review of universal credit. The UK government now has until March 2029 to submit a new report about the progress it has made, and whether it will be the same government, well, that remains to be seen. But the UN isn't the only quarter where the UK government is facing a challenge when it comes to the rights of disabled people. On Monday, disability activist Ellen Clifford was told she had been granted permission to take the government to court over their plans to tighten the eligibility for the work capability assessment. I spoke to Ellen earlier today, and I started by asking her why she was taking the government to court.
I'm taking the government to court over the consultation that they carried out at the end of last year into changes they were proposing to the work capability assessment that tests whether they think that disabled people are eligible for out-of-work disability benefits. The consultation was proposing that changes be brought in so that it would be much harder for certain groups to get points and therefore be found eligible for those out of work benefits. We are saying that we think that the consultation was too short. Usually when the Department for Work and Pensions does any consultation on a disability related matter, they give about 12 to 13 weeks in order to be accessible. But for this one, they only gave 8 weeks, I think it was.
What are you hoping the case will achieve, and is there precedent for it?
What we're hoping is that it will be ruled unlawful. And with the consultation, if a High Court rules that it's unlawful, as happened with the consultation around the closure of the independent living fund back under the coalition years that Deepak was heavily involved in. And with that one, all that happened is the government went away and they did the consultation again. And this time the minister evidenced better that, I think it was Mike Penning, it was a he, that he had paid due regard to the impacts of the consultation and just retook that decision to close it. They could just do that again, but we're talking about a government that is in its end of days before a general election. So really at this stage, we're trying to delay it.
Why do you think there's this repeated failure to actually involve disabled people and their representative organisations in making the decisions that affect their lives?
There has been regression in terms of the government speaking to deaf and disabled people and our organisations. It's very different across the four nations. In Scotland, there's a lot of talking, and of course, talking doesn't always lead to action. But in England, this is an England-specific issue, we really aren't involved. We aren't sat round the table. The government prefers to talk to the charities, and that's because the charities, they're non-user led and they are not as radical. They're nowhere near as radical as organisations run by deaf and disabled people, because where we run our organisations, these are our lives. So, you know, we are going to speak out and say it as it is. And this government has been they've been criticised repeatedly from the Work and Pensions Committee, from various different UN rapporteurs that have visited, for just not listening. I mean, the National Audit Office as well has said that when it comes to the Department for Work and Pensions, they're just not interested in any form of criticism. They know if they put proposals in front of us that's going to rob essential income from the poorest people in society, we're going to have a problem with that. And so they'd just rather not talk to us.
You don't have much faith that a Labour government will not drop the current policy when it comes to disabled people in this country. Why is that? Have there been any conversations with the Labour Party that Deepak has been able to have?
Deepak and other deaf and disabled people's organisations have had multiple conversations, not with Liz Kendall. I think the conversations with her have been fairly limited. We do speak a lot to the Shadow Minister for Disabled People. We are short on pledges. I think the idea is that we need to trust them. We need to trust that once they're elected, they will start delivering for us. They believe that if they start to stand up for us and speak out against the cuts that the Tories are waging on us, that they won't get elected. So they're saying these are traps that the government's laying for us. We can't come out against them, but trust us and we'll work with you when we're in power. But we know that their economic policy is not so different. It's more Tory-like than the kind of radical difference that we need to see. We're not even sure if they will scrap universal credit now, which was a long-standing commitment, which was hard won by disabled people campaigning against and within the Labour Party. We're not sure that that will be their policy now. We just don't know what it will be because, like I say, they say, well, we can't make pledges, you have to trust us.
This UN report is just the latest in a series of UN inquiries. And every time there is this damning indictment of the human rights violations that are being experienced by disabled and deaf people in the UK. And they make all these recommendations, but there seems to be no avenue to enforce them.
There is no avenue at all, because although it's an international treaty which the UK government has ratified, it really has no teeth within domestic legislation. That's one of the reasons why deaf and disabled people's organisations are campaigning for incorporation. What it really is a tool, and that's how we use it. It's a tool to try and raise awareness of what's actually happening. And it also provides a really important function in terms of validating the lived experience of deaf and disabled people, because we're so used to being marginalised and our voices not heard. And if you look at the recent rhetoric coming from Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt and Sunak himself about this mental health culture, and the demonizing of disabled people. And our voices really haven't been represented. We haven't had a chance to say, well, actually, the reality of the situation is very different from the way it's being presented. We very rarely get invited to speak to the media, for example, Novara being an exception. You do speak to us, but the mainstream media will just speak to the charities who, like I say, are very removed from the grassroots.
So within this hostile environment, what are the avenues that you have found for organising and getting disabled-led organisations' voices heard?
Legal challenges are actually one of the most useful ways, other than direct actions and protests, that we use to get people's voices heard, because the mainstream media has these set formats and they will turn up to a legal challenge. So if we do a vigil outside, we can prep our people so that we've got people who are willing to share their personal stories, because the mainstream media loves this hearts and minds stuff. We always have to have poor disabled people willing to share their stories. But if we kind of use those mainstream formats, we can sometimes get some kind of glimpse into the media world for our voices to be heard. The other thing really, though, for us, it's so important to build hope among people. We, as a movement, it's all about collectivizing our strength. It's about what every individual can do in terms of their contribution, which is valuable as part of a big, beautiful whole. I love the way that disabled people come together with all our different skills and talents. And each of us may have things that we find difficult, but each of us has things we can do as well. So it's when we kind of, the best way for that to happen is when we are organising our protests. So some people might be able to get out on the street, other people can do things online, other people can do the lobbying, other people do the evidence collecting, the researching. And that's how we got the UN inquiry. The special inquiry was triggered by disabled people against cuts. It was an unprecedented inquiry, never happened before, that the Disability Committee had investigated grave and systematic violations. And that was a big win for us, really. It's keeping going and getting out there and being bold, I think.
That was Ellen Clifford from DPAC. I just want to say a massive thank you to Tadhg for joining me tonight and lending your contributions.
Moya, an absolute pleasure as always.
You have been watching Novara Media. Please go and see my new documentary, So Gary Lets Me Make More. And if you want to come and support us financially so that we can make more documentaries, it's novara.media/support, I believe. Thank you very much. Good night.